Good evening, everyone, and a warm welcome to Daksha series. Our endeavor to throw light on topics of contemporary interest in a focused and thematic manner. In this inaugural edition of Daksha series, we focus on the theme of data, risks, and rights, a matter of great interest to lawyers and policymakers. I am Anand Padmanabhan, Dean at Daksha Fellowship, India's first fellowship for lawyers with specialization in three different pathways: technology, law and policy, law and regulation, and disputes resolution. We are grateful to LiveLaw for partnering with us on this conversation. On that note, let me introduce our speakers for today, both of whom have been extremely generous with their time in helping us conceptualize the Daksha Fellowship. Justice B.N. Srikrishna and Mr. Rahul Matan. Justice Srikrishna is eponymous with the commission that investigated causes and apportioned blame for the Mumbai riots of 1992 to 93. He's also served as chairperson of the Financial Sector Legislative Reforms Commission, and most recently, he has headed a 10-member expert committee to study and identify key data protection issues and recommend methods to address them. Rahul is a founding partner at Trilegal. He has advised on some of the largest telecom, media, and technology transactions in the country. He's also been involved in a number of policy initiatives in this space, including assisting the government in preparing the country's privacy law. He's a regular speaker and has a weekly column, Ex Machina, in Livemint on the interface of law and technology. His latest book, Privacy 3.0, Unlocking Our Data-Driven Future, has gained a lot of attention for its interesting insights on the interaction between rights and innovation. Before we begin this session, I would like to remind you that all participants in this session are on mute, but you can post your questions and queries in the Q&A tab, and we'll take it up at the end of the session. So with that, let me begin this session. Justice Sri Krishna, let me begin with you. It's really an honor to have you here with us. Last 3 to 4 years have seen a lot of activity around privacy, right? And the fact that the Supreme Court laid out the right to privacy, especially informational privacy as a fundamental right, means a lot. So before we get into the substantive aspects of this conversation, could you unpack for us what that verdict meant and how it has really translated in your thinking and conversations on data protection?
Thank you, Anand. Yes, for a long time, the question as to whether an individual has the right to privacy was itself debated. There are several cases which considered what would happen with regard to information collected about the medical status of an individual, about surveillance by investigating agencies. And different high courts have taken different views. Finally, some of them landed in the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court also surprisingly gave conflicting judgments. So there was no unanimity on what exactly is the right to privacy and how fundamental it was. So when the Aadhaar issue came up before the Supreme Court, one of the grounds on which the Aadhaar card and the Aadhaar entire system was challenged was that it would amount to a breach of the fundamental right of privacy. So the first question that was asked by the Supreme Court was, how do you say it is privacy, that right to privacy is a fundamental right? And that led to the formulation of a 9-judge bench, which had to examine and sift through all the existing judgments in India and abroad and arrive at this conclusion. Finally, it came down in that famous Puttaswamy judgment. The Supreme Court laid down finally that right to privacy is a fundamental right, which can be found in the right to life under Article 21 of the Constitution of India. So from there, several issues have come out of that. If it is the right to privacy, how does one ensure that it is protected? What happens when this right is breached by a private entity or by a public entity or the state? And what should be the safeguards which should be erected to protect this right of privacy? That has been the debate that has been going on. You're right, I did chair an expert committee on that. We went into the whole issue, had a lot of interaction, both in several urban centers of this country. We put in the public domain a white paper inviting responses. Then in fact, it was very interesting. We issued be in response to our the publication of the white paper. We received responses from several academicians, professors, activists, lawyers, even some former judges, both in this country and abroad. After collating all that, we formulated a report and a draft bill of the Personal Data Protection Act, which was also placed in the public domain. And it was also submitted to the Government of India, on the basis of which the government has come out with its own bill in 2019, which rightly has been sent to a committee of the Parliament to look into the various acts, because Parliament otherwise hardly has enough time to debate a complicated issue like this. So it's still unfortunately pending before the JPC and has not seen the light of the day. So this is the state of affairs as far as data privacy is concerned. And of course now with COVID-19, another vector has been added to the dimensions, which we will talk about today probably.
Sure. Thank you, sir. So Rahul, let me pull you now into the conversation. I think Justice Sri Krishna began with a host of very important issues related to informational privacy, right? In particular, he mentioned sensitive health data, and he also mentioned surveillance. Right? And some of your work very recently has really looked at this interaction between technology and rights, right? And in some sense, how do you design technology to, avoid some of these concerns, while at the same time, of course, the legal protection, which wearing the lawyer's hat is something you're very familiar with. So now we are in times of pandemic, really seeing this whole conversation about technology and rights take a very new dimension. I mean, just to quickly sort of sum up the things that we are seeing around us. Right? I mean, whether it's tracking your health data, having an integration of this health data with multiple authorities so that there is no information asymmetry, right? Or moving the next step to developing apps and technological solutions for contact tracing and so on, or even using technology for enforcing the quarantine measures, right, which are quite critical to ensure that there is no rampant spread of COVID, right? In all these different ways, we are seeing technology being deployed. So we are talking about very different kinds of technologies here, but it would be helpful if you could start unpacking for us what these technologies mean, how they operate, and what are their implications for privacy, both in the short run, and of course, we can deliberate later on the long run as well.
So thanks, Anant. And first of all, let me congratulate you for running this program. I think after all the hard work you've put in, absolutely no one could have predicted a global pandemic. But I've been watching this online pivot that you've done, and who knows, you may never need that campus. You may just do this like this.
I hope the Tamil Nadu government gets that. But
yeah. Look, I mean, this is the reason why a lot of my work for the last almost a decade has been trying to think about privacy in the context of technology. Because what we've seen is that technology evolves really rapidly, and what we write down as a sacrosanct rule as to how to deal with privacy and the privacy issues comes tumbling down the moment there's some new technology or some new event. And up until now, we've had new technologies that have forced us to change the way we think about some privacy principles. One of the things I've spoken about in the past is we would never have needed a right to be forgotten if we didn't invent search engines that never forgot. Because the whole purpose of, say, a bankruptcy law is, and that's sort of the right to be forgotten, came out of a bankruptcy case where someone was bankrupt, 10, 20 years ago, and whenever someone searched in Google, that kept coming up, right? And so he said, look, I need to be forgotten. Now, he would have been forgotten if it wasn't for an invention in technology. Now, similarly, right now, we're in a situation where we have a pandemic. The thing with a pandemic is that we've got to find ways to save lives, and we, for the first time, and we've had many pandemics in human history, but for the first time, we think we have, because we never tried these before, we've never had these opportunities to try them before, but we think we have technological tools that will allow us to save lives. Now, in order to deploy these tools, we are going to need to constrain liberties of people. And so, as you said, there are many ways in which that is done. The first is, if you go down to the infected individual, you want to ensure that the infected individual does not infect other people. One of the ways that you can do it is take all infected people and put them in a quarantine hospital. But as we know, hospitals are going to be filled very soon. And so the other thing is, can we use technology to geofence them in a sense? So tell them that you must stay within this area, and if you go out, there'll be an alert somewhere, and then the police will come. Now, when you say something like that, it sounds very similar to something else which we react very sharply to, which is prison. This is a good description of putting someone in jail. And we know that putting someone in jail is a drastic restriction on fundamental liberties. So that's one category where you prevent the infected person from infecting further. The other thing with this epidemic, and that's where contact tracing comes in, is that if you can ensure that you track down all the people who an infected person has come in contact with, you have the ability to break the chain of infection. One of the characteristics of COVID-19 is that people remain asymptomatic for a very long time compared to most other diseases, which means you can be asymptomatic. Actually, there's evidence that a lot of people are asymptomatic throughout the time. They just get COVID, they remain asymptomatic, and as if nothing happens, they get back to normal. But in the process, they have been infecting people. And some of those people who they infect may not be so lucky and may actually get a serious complication. So then if we can find a technology solution to prevent people from infecting other people, or at least track down the people who they have infected, such that we can start telling them that they are potentially infected, we have another technological solution to save lives. And so the contact tracing solution is built out of that. Now, contact tracing is actually a very well tried and tested mechanism for dealing with epidemics. Essentially, what you did in a non-technology context is, if there's an infected person, you sit him down and say, can you recall where you went over the last 14 days? And that's what's happening even today, even without the contact tracing apps. People are using their memory to recall where they've been and who they came in contact with. I landed in a plane, so everyone in the airport, then I hadn't got into an Uber. What's the number of the Uber? You got your Uber receipt, you find the Uber number, and in that painstaking, methodical way, you will find people. The problem with this is human memory is fallible and you will not remember everything. And secondly, if you went to a market or you went to a mall, there is no way you can know the people who you came in contact with. What the contact tracing app does essentially is it allows you if there are phones which have got the app on it, it allows those phones to share information between each other. And when they share that information, if any one of those people gets infected, you have a record, you have a data log of the people they came in contact with, so that if someone gets infected, you can actually reach out to them. Now, of course, this has privacy implications in itself, in that now there are an exponential number of people. We're at, I think, 97 million with Arogya Setu right now, an exponential number of people sharing information with each other. And that could potentially be a privacy risk if that information goes out. So that is the framework with it. And there are many other such apps. Let's maybe focus on these two for a while, and I'm happy to get into the others as well. But I think those are the parameters within which we need to think about the question. And I think central to all of this is that this is a pandemic. People are dying. And already, the nations of the world have been in lockdown for an inordinate amount of time. A lockdown off of itself constitutes a restriction on personal liberty. This is another form of restriction on personal liberty, but quite frankly, how far is too far? And perhaps that's sort of the thing that we should discuss in the rest of the conversation.
Right. So Justice Krishna, just coming back to you exactly on that point, right? Even the committee that you chaired, of course, took the view that none of these rights are really absolutist. There are situations where there can be exceptions. And at some level, what Rahul is implying is the same point, right? That there is a sort of emergency situation here, and we need to, sort of gather all this data and these apps have to work in a certain manner. But at the same time, the committee did look into many rights which had to be given to individuals as well as certain exceptions, and there are ways in which those exceptions may be operationalized. Right? And that's exactly what the Supreme Court did in the privacy verdict too. So could you sort of tie in all those conversations on the restrictions on the right and your view on what is really going on around us?
Anand, it's very interesting that all the bad laws in the world come up during emergency situations. Take your Income Tax Act for the first time. There was nothing like income tax in India, and it was the Second World War which needed, which required government to raise a lot of money. So they came out with the Income Tax Act in 1961. And I don't know whether you know it, but Income Tax Act of 61, not 61, the previous one, I forget the exact year. It was bruited about as a temporary measure. All the tenancy laws in the country, the most criticized tenancy laws, like the Bombay Tenancy Act or the Maharashtra Tenancy Act, as they call, came up during the Second World War period. And it was also called a temporary legislation to be scrapped the moment the need disappeared. Therefore, the lesson to be learned is, well, this is not true necessarily of India, it's true of all power centers all over the world. Power is acquired by state in the name of an emergent situation which it has to face, whether it is a war or a pandemic or whatever else, or even financial stringency of various kinds. Once the power has been acquired, please note, the power has been acquired in order to enable it to meet a contingency. Once that has been acquired, it must necessarily be used effectively to deal with the contingency for the benefit of the citizens at large. There is no doubt about that. Having done that, when the contingency is behind you, is there an honest intention to relinquish the power? Is the million-dollar question. Now, if that was there would have been no difficulty at all. Then there is no need to hedge around it and then build walls around such a power. Whether it's the power of detention of a human being, whether it's the power of detaining his fiscal resources or financial health and the physical health, whatever. Now, the only difficulty that arises, that is the reason, if you remember, you rightly pointed out that in the report, we had said that the state must necessarily be considered the power to deal with emergent situations like, say, criminal investigation, military secrets, terrorist activities, terrorist funding, and things like that. Those are also really emergency situations where there is no time to sit and debate. State must have the power. But then the question is the state really using the power for that or something else? Therefore, you have to have a parameter on which you must judge. And there must be a judge. I don't mean a judge in the sense of a judge of a court. What I mean is an arbiter who will independently decide that this action is necessary for this purpose and so much of action is necessary. That is why the triple test evolved by the Supreme Court in Puttaswamy case said all fundamental rights can be subjected to restriction only by a law validly passed by the parliament or the state legislature. Number two, it must have a declared object and it must also be proportionate to what is sought to be achieved. And finally, a good mechanism which will be able to ensure that the power is not abused. That is where we had said that these are larger issues, and therefore, when you come to deal with data and the privacy of data, since the privacy of data has been found to reside in Article 21, which is the right to life, which is also the repository of the fundamental freedom of the human being in this country. Therefore, whatever sanctity with which you deal with a fundamental right under Article 21 must be accorded to the right of privacy also. That is the reason why we said there should be a law which is proportionate, which takes into account the parameters laid down by the Supreme Court. And if such a law is passed, the law will pass the test of constitutionality. Anything else will be struck down legitimately as unconstitutional. That is the difficulty which will face us even with regard to mechanism for contact tracing. Now, Contact tracing may be absolutely necessary, as Rahul rightly said. What was being done by physically visiting the patient, sitting down with him, scratching his memory and getting detailed information is made easy by technology. But this is a never-ending contest between progress and technology. Now, cars are necessary in order to quickly go from place A to place B. But in their wake, they also bring in pollution. Then you want aircrafts are necessary to travel from country to country or within the country. They bring in within their wake accidents, insurance claim. So therefore, there must be technology must be met with the law which will ensure that the technology runs on guided rails for the benefit and not the detriment of the citizens. That should be the larger issue. As long as technology gives us benefits, fine. The day we find that it is intruding upon our rights and making us slaves to somebody else, we should put a stop to it. That is my take on the whole issue, whether it is your technology for contact tracing or technology for anything else. This has been a debate that has been going on from ages onwards. So the debate between the contest between progress and liberties. Now this is something, now it will appear in the form of, in the context of the emergency caused by the pandemic, and how it will play out will have to be debated.
Rahul, picking on the theme of law, right? I mean, with Arogya Setu, I mean, in full disclosure, we know that you have also advised the government, right? And one of the challenges is that, there was a certain assumption, right? That your data is going to be retained for a certain number of days. And now today the Empowered Group has come out with a mandate which looks a little conflicting and which seems to indicate that for about 180 days, NIC is going to keep this data, right? And all of it, I think, goes to the larger point that there's no legislative backing to some of what has happened in the last, month or so, right? I mean, that's one part of the problem. The other is, can we bake in some of these protections into the code itself, right? I mean, we are increasingly in a scenario where a lot of these concerns can be addressed at the code level, and you have, looked at Aadhaar quite in a quite detailed manner, right? And there too, some of these questions had come up in the past, especially questions of data security, right? And ensuring that the data is not accessible to multiple authorities to avoid the building up of a sort of digital panopticon, right? So there are two different parts really to my question. One is, why do we need a law, and what does the law do? What kinds of safeguards and trust can a law help in building? And similarly, what can technology do in parallel to build these, same positive consequences and lead to a more virtuous cycle rather than distrust?
No, I mean, excellent questions. And I'd like to pick up on what Justice Sri Krishna said in his opening remarks, which is that, look, the ideal law at this point in time would have been the PDP bill. So if the PDP bill was in place, the PDP bill gives us the guardrails that we need in order to build any privacy, I wouldn't say invasive, anything which even affects privacy, because there are principles set out in the PDP bill. There is a regulator that has been identified under the PDP bill with powers to actually step in at a time like this and say, look, we never, when we drafted this bill, no one ever thought that a pandemic would shut the country down and would kill people at the rate that it is. So these are the principles that are laid down in the law, and this is how I think it needs to be applied in the context of a pandemic. It would have been extremely helpful to central, state government, etc., to have these guardrails. It's a two-stage guardrails. One is the guardrails of the principles, and the principles are well articulated. Purpose limitation, use limitation, data minimization, data deletion, data retention, all of these principles are very, very clearly articulated in the PDP bill. But there is not one word in the PDP bill of what to do when there is a pandemic, and rightly so, because no one predicted it. And the logic, therefore, is that you would have a regulator who would then take the principles and articulate it in the context of whatever emerges. So it would have been lovely to have the PDP bill around. But as you said, the second point that you made, which is that we can still work it into court. And So when I was invited by the government of India to help draft the privacy policy and help with the privacy aspects of this, the way I thought about it was, let's just assume that the principles of the PDP bill are the principles that would guide the creation of the privacy policy. And then let's go down principle by principle to see what we can implement actually into the code. So if you look at the privacy policy, it has a very specific, narrowly drafted purpose limitation provision. So it says that it identifies the types of data that is collected very specifically. There is no, I would challenge anyone to find any equivalent of etc., including which is what lawyers like us constantly use, because we know that we can never think of every eventuality. I challenged the developers, and quite frankly, they were very happy to participate in this exercise to say, look, tell me everything that you need. Don't say, look, I might think of something later, because if you think of something later, you have to go out and change the privacy policy. You have to be specific about your purposes. So first, purpose is very clearly mentioned, including one provision right at the bottom which says it shall not be used for any purpose other than those listed above, very explicitly saying that. The second is anonymization, and now this is not the anonymization that Justice Sri Krishna refers to in the PDP bill. This is more along the lines of the de-identification that he refers to. So as soon as you register, your identity is stripped off, which means your phone number and your name is taken out, replaced with a random number. And in all your transactions with the app going forward, it's that random number that actually is used. Third is, by default, data remains on the phone. So it's designed such that contact information, whenever you meet someone, is shared between the two phones. And quite frankly, as long as it remains on the phone, there is very little risk, because there is only you who has that information. It's encrypted. You can't see who you have come in contact with. It is only if you turn COVID positive that the data is pulled from the phone and sent to the server. And if you think about the percentages, it's, at this point in time, I think we're at about 97 million users. I think maybe 10, 12,000 users data has been pulled. These are all the people who have turned COVID positive and who have the Arogya Setu app. So if you look at the proportion of the number of people whose data is still on the phone, it's a very heavy proportion. And then finally, we've got a rigorous data deletion mechanism. So, as Justice Sri Krishna said, what if the data is used for something else? Yes, that is a concern, because if you leave data around, it is valuable. And the more you accumulate the data, the more valuable it becomes. So the data is deleted from your phone on a 30-day rolling cycle, which means, if you've had the app for 30 days today, tomorrow, the first days of worth of data will be deleted, and day after the second, and so on, until there is no data left on your phone after the pandemic is over. If the data is pulled to the cloud and you don't turn COVID positive, your data is deleted in 45 days. And if you do turn COVID positive, your data is deleted 60 days after you are declared to be healthy. So there is a, built into code, there is a mechanism to remove the data in a specified manner at a specified time. So yes, look, I wish we had the PDP bill and I wish we had a DPA that could tell us what to do. But the idea was that absent those, what best can we put into code so that even in the absence of a privacy law, we have the ability to actually tick the boxes on all the principles that Justice Sri Krishna articulated in that law to the best extent possible.
So Justice Sri Krishna, again, going back to the issue of the PDP bill, right? I think there are a lot of learnings that we can take from the Aadhaar debate and controversy and then bring it to bear to inform this whole issue of surveillance, right? I mean, because that's a huge concern. And while, of course, the PDP bill does, have some safeguards, at least the one that you proposed had quite a bit of safeguards to think through the questions of proportionality and so on. I still think that one big concern is really the linking of multiple databases, right? And how that gives a overall picture of a citizen and what he or she is up to, right? And here we are really talking about health data, location data, right? So I think there are a lot of these pieces of information which, as you rightly classify in the bill as sensitive personal data, right? Which can potentially be provided to one particular entity, but residing in multiple, different entities, right, for their particular uses. And we saw that with Aadhaar. It was a real, issue, and the Supreme Court, whatever it did with it, finally, I personally feel that the dissenting opinion did a much better job of understanding the institutional risk that that causes. So could you share your thoughts on this idea of a digital panopticon?
First, let me deal with what Rahul talked about, this app for dealing with this contact tracing, etc.
Sure.
That's the one that's called Arogya. What is it called? Arogya Setu, right?
Arogya Setu.
Now, Rahul, I have had an occasion to look at the order that has been issued by the empowered group. Now, and first of all, first question that arises is, after that, I looked into it's supposed to be deriving its authority from the National Disaster Management Act, or it's called National Disaster Management Act.
NDMA, correct.
The Disaster Management Act has concepts of national authority, state authority, district authority, and local authorities who have been given different powers. Now, it doesn't talk of any empowered group. What is an empowered group? Who is an empowered group? Now, under the business rules of the Government of India, there is a particular methodology by which every executive order has to be issued. First of all, I think it's highly objectionable that such an order is issued at the executive level. As I repeatedly said, and I continue to say, that such an order has to be backed by parliamentary legislation, which will authorize the government to issue such an order. There does not seem to be one. If it is to be traced to the Disaster Management Act, there is no provision there for constitution of such a, empowered group. No wonder what provision of law is this order issued? I can't understand. Number two, if you remember, and I'm sure you will remember, you are such an expert on data privacy, that one of the biggest issues that concerns everybody is breach of data. Now, if there is a data breach here, who is answerable? What is the action to be taken? Who will be held accountable for the data breach? This should really have been traced either to the PDP Act or to the disaster management by an appropriate amendment made therein. This is some kind of a patchwork which is really going to cause more concern to the citizens than the benefit it brings them, honestly. Number one. And coming back to the question that Anand posed me. Anand, first of all, can I ask you for a little qualification of pose the question again, because it set me thinking in a different direction after I dealt with Rahul's.
Right, sir. Right, sir. So the question was really that in the Aadhaar context, we saw this whole gathering of data, which was...
I got it now. See, what happened in Aadhaar, this is exactly ties up with my thinking right now. When this Aadhaar was sought to be mandated compulsorily, what did the Supreme Court do? Examine that and said, what business have you to take data of the citizens without their consent? Because in privacy law, the desideratum, the minimum ground level is the consent of the person concerned. It is only exceptionally that you can take the data without consent under various circumstances that the PDP bill has enumerated. And that is exactly what the GDPR does, and everywhere in a democratic polity, that is how it's done. Now, the Supreme Court, therefore, what did they ultimately hold? They held that if a person wants a benefit from the government, and the government has to really look at it statistically, he has to give his Aadhaar card so that the government can give the benefit. That is why they prohibited private entities from collecting Aadhaar numbers. They said, what business have you to collect it? Even the government was not permitted, except when the party, when a citizen or an individual applied to the government for getting a benefit under benefit scheme run by the government. Only exception was made, I suppose, because of the tax laws in the PAN card and being related to the Aadhaar card, and the Aadhaar card being related to the Income Tax Act by an amendment to the Income Tax Act. So ultimately, the tracing has to go back to some legislative warrant for it. You can't sit there in Delhi and issue an order and say, hey, this order from tomorrow, everybody's every data will be collected. Because, as I said, what starts off with great beneficial ideas ultimately will, at the end of some period, when the emergency does ceases to exist, will be hardwired into a regime which is disastrous for any citizen of a democratic country. That is my problem, and that is exactly what is being articulated by several activists, and that is a problem. And here also, look at your Rahul, I saw that protocol which has been issued. First of all, I don't know under what provision of law it has been issued. I'll assume there is some, it can be traced. Why couldn't this have been reduced into an ordinance? I suppose Parliament is not functioning now. I think if they are on recession basis or something. If Parliament is not in a position to act, then obviously an ordinance can be issued, which will be replaced after 180 days by Parliament as soon as Parliament starts functioning. States have run their states on ordinance Raj for years together. For an emergency situation like this, it is ideal for the ordinance to have been issued. And if an ordinance has been issued, it would have been easier to read all this into the ordinance and say that this is exactly what the Supreme Court has said, and including that sunset clause and all that. Except that only problem is what happens if there is a breach is not mentioned here, and that is where I feel the absence of a data privacy law.
Correct. Anand, can I respond? Because
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So Justice Sri Krishna, first of all, as you have been an advisor to the government many times. This is I haven't been as many times as you have, and in the podcast that you did with me, you mentioned that 7 times have been unlucky. All your advice has not been taken. So I completely appreciate the point that you're making on having a legislative backing. The protocol, I view it slightly differently. And the way I view it, and I encourage you to tell me if my viewing it is incorrect or not. But data is being collected right now. Data is being collected by NIC, which is a department under MeitY. And I think it is fit and proper for MeitY to set out a list of rules and a list of protocols as to what should be done when this data is collected. We can have a privacy policy in the app, but that privacy policy essentially is something between the citizens, or the citizen and the state. But what about within the state? So the protocol, the way I read it, was as a data sharing protocol. It is MeitY saying, look, I am collecting this information. I know that this information has to be shared with health workers. It has to be shared with sanitation workers. There are various people who potentially have to get access to this information such that they can take the next step. Once you found out who the contact is, that's only the beginning of the journey. There are many, many steps that have to follow after that. Now, in that process, we must have guardrails. And the protocol, in a sense, establishes the guardrails for how the data can be shared. I would imagine, and I'm not fully sure about the authority of the Empowered Committee. I'm with you on it doesn't seem to be a statutory entity. But in the absence, equally, the point I'm trying to make is I think equally it is important for the government to set guardrails for itself as to what it needs to do with the data now that it has got this data. And there are a couple of things which I thought were interesting in that, which is it's quite limited. I think there is only one provision where it talks about sharing further than within the government. And even there, I think it says anyone to whom it is shared must abide by the same protocol. And you also mentioned the sunset provision, and the sunset clause, it says that it will be reviewed in 6 months, but it actually says equally that the intention is for this to remain for 6 months. And if it's not reviewed, it will only remain for 6 months. Now, it's important to, a lot of people have said, why is there no sunset clause in the app itself? Now, you can't have a sunset clause in an app because an app will continue as long as the developers support it. But if you have a sunset clause that the person who is running the app imposes on itself, I think there is value in that. And so, maybe I'm the optimist and you're the pessimist, but if you look at the glass, it's both half empty and half full. And we should, I think, look at these principles as well, just to say that this is, in my mind, not a substitute for a law. We certainly do need a law if we are making it mandatory.
That's the point, Rahul. That is exactly my point. If it is intended to be a departmental circular for the department to behave itself, and it is only saying, hey, when you collect data, you do this, A, B, C, D, excellent, because this really gives them an idea of the purpose limitation, time limitation, for everything that is conceived in a properly designed data privacy policy. But if you come to me, I don't want to, I'm an old man. I don't understand technology. I don't have a smartphone. You insist that I buy a smartphone. You insist that I must have this, download this app, and then collect it. I said, under what law are you asking me to do all this? As a citizen?
You're right. The protocol, I don't think, talks about the fact that it is mandatory. And in fact, I agree with you that is a gap. I mean, if we are making something mandatory, we need to have some legal backing for it. But I think that's the reason why I was trying to make the distinction, because the protocol, in a sense, is a missing link. Because otherwise, we've got the regulation between the Arogya Setu user and MeitY. But we don't have a protocol between MeitY and the other user departments. And now we have that. And so in a sense, it makes this framework more robust.
Correct. I agree. I'm not on this question of whether it is useful. According to me, it's tremendously beneficial. In fact, I must congratulate you as being part of the entire design. It's well conceived of, but then the real authority to it, if it is to be used against every citizen, must come from some source. And that source is missing. Number two, as long as it is voluntary, the same rule that the Supreme Court evolved in the case of Aadhaar will apply. If you want it, take it subject to this. If you don't want it, you're free not to take it. But then I'm told, I don't know, my knowledge, of course, has become muted thanks to newspapers. I don't even get newspapers here. I'm trying to read as much as on the e-papers. So somewhere in the newspapers, I read that the government is thinking of mandating this to every private employer, every company, that the employee should have this kind of a download this app. Under what authority is that being done, if that is true? And I didn't read it. I didn't read it on a fake WhatsApp message.
You're right. Sorry, Ananta, if I can.
Yeah, no, absolutely. No.
You're right. I think there was an MHA order which mentioned this in the annex, and that certainly has got a lot of people concerned. But let's park that for a moment, because I'd like to discuss a few counterfactuals with you.
Yes.
Because when the world goes ahead, even if we manage to deal with this, we're going to have a very different post-COVID world. And I can envision scenarios where, for instance, to get onto a plane, particularly for an international flight, people
Yes.
may say, look, you are going to be in this confined tube for 9-10 hours. Airlines may say, I want to be sure that you are not infected, and that if you are infected, I will want to be able to figure out, look, can I get in touch with you? So there may be, the point I'm trying to make is there may be, so a mass mandating of something is like the other situation that you explained. But in limited circumstances where there is a threat to life and livelihood, would it be possible to mandate? And I ask this in the context of we are already prevented from carrying bombs or explosives onto a plane. There is a DGCA order which says certain types of carry-on is not allowed, certain types of things are just not allowed to be carried. I mean, is it in that context possible for the government to, in limited circumstances, say, look, to use this service or to partake in this facility, you may need to have, I don't know, Arogya Setu, maybe what it is now, it could be some other technology innovation at a later point in time. What is your thinking on that?
No, I totally agree with you. I recently saw a video in which some of the persons who were brought back to India by an Air India flight, the way they were fighting, and they said you have charged us so much, $3,000 per one single ticket, a single journey, and you are not even allowing a gap of a seat in between us. All three of us or four of us are sitting together, and there was a big ruckus on that. Now I agree. If you look at that kind of a scenario, or if you look at the suburban trains that run in Mumbai,
Correct.
I shudder to think what even if one person is infected.
Yes. No,
Therefore,
that's a great point. Yeah.
It may be possible either under the Railways Act or under the Aircraft Act to mandate that the DGCA in such instances will be able to give a direction, just as you rightly said. You're not allowed to carry this kind of, you're not even a matchbox, forget the matchbox, not even nail clippers are allowed. Look at it. Now, that is more disastrous than a nail clipper in any case. Therefore, if you are found to have been infected, either carrying the infection or you are in contact with an infected person within a specified period, well, quarantine longer, they are always there. When I go to South Africa and come back, I have to produce a health certificate. Otherwise, after 14 days, they detain me in the quarantine. Similarly, this can be utilized tremendous beneficial advantage. But only thing is, hem it in with safeguard, because once all this goes away, it will become, in fact, I say, I suggest make it a permanent law if you want. Because today pandemic is COVID-19. What if there is a COVID-20, COVID-30 or 35? Which, look, the difficulty with COVID is that there is no method of discovering what is the etiology, what is the diagnosis, what is the prognosis of the disease. So we are all shooting in the air. So if I happen to contact this, now if my body can't sustain it, it's a death warrant for me. That is the reason why it is so serious. Whereas with other diseases, it can be contained, it can be cured under certain circumstances, depending on the constitution of the patient. Therefore, this can even be a good method of dealing with such a situation in the future. I have no problem with that, as long as it is fenced in with a regulatory apparatus or a legislatory boundary, which will ensure its constitutional validity and ensure that it is not abused if somebody wants to abuse it. That's the whole idea.
So Rahul, I would like to take it one step further from the legality to the very fact that, look at the title of this conversation, right? Data governance and democratic ethos. The classic counter to all these scenarios about, law and so on is China, right? And somewhere you just bring it up anytime we have these conversations around what technology can do and the efficiency gains and so on, right? And today we are really seeing that in China in the context of COVID, right? The gradation, the ability to sort of mark individuals as red zone, green zone, whatever, right? So what we are doing, they're doing it at a much higher, pace and scale of efficiency. But somewhere, the larger question then looms as to where do you draw the line from a democratic point of view, right? Because these can really undermine democratic values from a very institutional baseline perspective, right? It's not the same, and you can see that distinction, right? It's not the same as a policeman going and knocking on one individual's door at night, where it's a writ petition filed and that individual says my right is violated. We are here talking about solutions which lower as a community the privacy baseline that we enjoy, right? So what are your thoughts on that? Because I think it's a deeper philosophical issue too, right? It's not just about having that law in place.
No, you're absolutely right. These are the sorts of things that that I agonize over when I do my work, because just as for every situation of tremendous benefit, you can find opportunities for tremendous injustice. And the challenge with any new technology is that it usually takes a long period of time and a large number of people suffering before we realize that the technology is actually harmful. These technologies are not like a knife or a nuclear bomb where you see instant results. When you're a society that depends on technology and data-driven decisions to get all your benefit, you don't realize until maybe 3, 4, maybe a decade also, that at the cost for getting that benefit has been tremendous marginalization to people who you never thought would be marginalized. It's only after the fact that you realize it. So this is really the root of the problem, I think, when you talk about, and even your program, hopefully you will think about this very deeply. I think the fundamental challenge with this debate is that the benefit is immediately evident, and the harms are, in fact, not evident at all. And a policymaker today, unlike in the past where it was a lot more binary, a policymaker, a draftsman of a law, needs to constantly doubt the reliance that they place on a technology solution by thinking of all the harms, unintended consequences in particular, that can come out of it. It's not easy. Because as we started out saying, this is a pandemic. No one ever thought that we would be in a pandemic. And so no one ever plans for what are the data protection principles we should apply when we're in a pandemic. And that's a pandemic. It could be anything in the future, right? A lot of people are saying that we will use data to allow India to leapfrog its poor people into the formal economy. Many steps have been taken to do that. But no one right now knows harmful consequences would result to a lot of people who are not able to get into that data economy. And I think we should be thinking about that as well. We are a democracy. And so the democratic principles by which our constitution has been written and by which we have run ourselves must always be paramount. And that is equality, non-discrimination. All of these principles are really important. And so as we adopt technology, we have to check techno-optimism and balance it with this understanding of the way in which the fabric of the nation is drawn up. These are not easy to do, Anant, and that's sort of the reason why I say there is a dilemma in my head. There's also the comparative benefit. If you look at the success that China has had in, if you call it success, in controlling the pandemic, I don't think if this disease started in any other country, they would have been able to bring it under control as quickly as they did, precisely because they are able to adopt these sorts of completely authoritarian measures. Now, it has benefited in them reducing the disease burden, but at the same time, it comes at a tremendous social cost. And as a nation, and nations of Europe have said we absolutely don't want it. Sweden has said we don't really care. We are not going to do any lockdown. People can walk around. We will do social distancing. Some people will die, but our right to walk around freely is inherent to us. Other countries have taken different views. India has said we must lock down for 5 weeks or 6 weeks, or whichever way you look at it. And we have to arrive at that balance when it comes to technology. Very, very hard to do. And quite frankly, in a lot of my work, I keep thinking, how far is too far? How much should you hold back? What are the things that you must think of second order consequences, and how much can you influence policy to ensure that you don't end up creating second order harms?
Yes, Sri Krishna, before we open up for questions, just one last question, which again goes back to some of your work as part of the Financial Sector Reforms Commission, which is the idea of the arbiter, right? And we have seen that when creating regulatory institutions that are meant to protect these rights, because finally someone has to enforce these guardrails, right? In the context of technology in particular, I mean, I'm going entirely with one example, which is the UIDAI. There is some degree of confusion on thinking about what these bodies do and the multiple functions vested with them, right? And part of the Aadhaar controversy, some of the failings of Aadhaar, I think, has been structuring that arbiter or that regulatory body, like having powers of data custodianship versus powers of reporting data breaches versus compliance penalties. And you seem to have done taken a slightly different approach with the BPA. So could you speak a little bit about how one could create these regulatory mechanisms from a logistics, brass tacks point of
view? Whenever I have been asked this question, particularly with reference to Aadhaar card, I've always said that never put the carriage or the cart before the horse. If you do that, neither the horse nor the cart can be useful. Now, this is exactly what the government did. If they had a proper data privacy policy in place, then fitting Aadhaar onto it would have been simple. It's something like, you are given a button and you try to stitch a coat around it. Hello, that can never be done. I mean, people may do it, but not a very sensible idea according to me. Best thing is to cut your coat according to your measurements. See where the button needs to be sewn. Sew the button there. That should have been done. Otherwise, what will happen is, when Rahul was talking about democratic principles, what occurred to my mind was this. Look at what happened during the 18 months of emergency. I'll assume for a moment that the emergency was not fake and it was genuine. What happened? It was necessary because there was all kinds of insurgency in the country. You had to control it. Otherwise, the entire body politic would shatter down. Agreed. But then, what happened? How was democratic principles, how were they flouted to such an extent that a very great law officer gets up in the Supreme Court and says, during an emergency, you can shoot down a question and no questions can be asked. a should on a person and no questions can be asked because there are no fundamental rights. I mean, is that democracy? All powers were ceded in favor of the government in order to ensure that the liberties were intact. But did you hold that principle? This is exactly the point that we boiled down. Look, ultimately the bottom line is this. All laws, and I keep saying this in every public appearance I made, every speech, I've written very little because I'm too lazy to write articles. Every speech I say is, all laws must be citizen-centric. It is for the citizens' benefit that you are making a law. Now we have turned around 180 degrees and say, oh, the government wants the law, citizens should obey. Hello, citizen obeys so that the government may protect his rights, protect his liberty. If you have this kind of a vision in mind, I'm sure policy can be properly tailored in a democratic system. Now in China, you can run a road roller through my house. They want to have a road here tomorrow. But you can't do it in a democratic country, and you are right. Sweden has rightly said that we don't care, we want this. Because you see, the priority between two conflicting choices is that of the citizens. If as a citizen I say, no, we are happy, then government can't say, no, no, I want you to be healthy. No, no, I want you to do this. I want you to eat this or eat not this or whatever the government wants to say. Therefore, we come back to this. In a democracy, there is always a conflict between two conflicting views. One is towards technology with its benefits and technology with its negative factors. Now, how much you can control and how much is beneficial or not is certainly a matter of the policy that the particular polity wants to adopt. Now, if we want to go to the extreme right or extreme left, or as we always say, the Madhyama Marga, you take whatever you want according to your genius at the relevant time and in history, and you see the consequences. Take your nuclear technology. Nuclear technology has produced atomic bombs, and you have got hydrogen bombs, and I don't know what other bombs are going to be in the offing. But at the same time, nuclear power has really solved a lot of power shortage in our country, and it has really helped in agriculture. The gamma radiation has prevented a lot of cancer-related activities. How far you can take it is a matter of ultimate policy. And we as citizens are bound to express our views and hope that somebody somewhere is listening to it. And even if he is not going to follow it, at least spends 5 minutes in thinking about it.
Sure. So we have about, I would request for another 10 minutes of your grace time, so then we can have around 15 minutes of Q&A, and because there are quite a few questions. So let me begin with a question that Denson Abraham has posed. There is a Madhya Pradesh government website which contains data of about 40,000 patients who are quarantined with Arogya Setu on their phones. Everyone is able to access it, including citizens and companies and even the phone maker. Their current location and names are clearly available. Is this a breach of privacy?
Of course, it's a breach of privacy. Had the PDP been applicable, there would have been immediate action taken. What is the breach of privacy? Why should my health condition be advertised to the world at large? I can understand you have to collect the data so that I'm quarantined, my contact persons are appropriately dealt with. But you can't have it to put up a notice board and say that to the world that this man has got this kind of a disease. Now tomorrow they may do it for some other disease also. Why only coronavirus?
Right. An anonymous attendee has asked a question relating to the FP-Jio deal and the data privacy implications of the same.
What is FP-Jio?
The Facebook Jio deal very recently, and would like to know your thoughts on what are the potential data privacy implications of the deal.
You see, the point is, it is a strategic investment. A strategic investment by definition means that it is an investment intended to further the business interest of the investee as well as the investor. So obviously, it is not being done just to improve its financial prospects. Facebook definitely has interest in ensuring that through using the good offices or the good business contacts of Jio, they want to carry on with their whatever activity they want. Conversely, Jio wants to have a ride on Facebook's wagon for the better benefits of its own business. It raises two different issues. One issue is issue with regard to the competition law. Now, competition law has a regulator who is enabled on a complaint being made to investigate facts, go into various aspects, and finally come to a conclusion and say that this is anti-competitive, it's contrary to Section 4, I think. Section 4 of that, it disturbs the market, blah, 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 and then there is sufficient power. With data, without the PDP Act coming into force, where is the regulator? Now, I can't say who is going to be the regulator who will issue an order to any entity. Now, if he issues an order to Jio or to Facebook, they will say, under what law are you issuing this order to us? Who are you in the first place? Now, data regulation becomes a big issue there because of absence of regulator. And the regulator is absent because there is no law really which backs it. Again, it comes to the chicken and egg story. Therefore, it has implications. Now, how far the implications are good or bad will be seen only after the deal materializes. I don't have the deal been concluded. I'm not sure of that.
Okay.
Rahul, would you like to weigh in on that?
I mean, I don't know. I don't think the deal has been formalized. I would imagine that there would be competition implications. But, I agree with what Justice Sri Krishna says. I think most people haven't raised this as one of the reasons why we desperately need a privacy law. But these sorts of deals will happen. And without a regulator, we're relying on the two respective companies being good citizens and not violating the terms of their own privacy policy. If we had a regulator, we would have at least some authority looking into it and saying, is this okay? Can you make these changes? And then I will say it's okay. It's just what the Competition Commission does. I mean, Competition Commission goes into it and doesn't say yes or no immediately. It will give you an opportunity to make some declarations and then proceed with the deal. And similarly, we need someone to look into this. This is, I don't know, Justice Sri Krishna, if in your roundtables anyone ever made this point, but this is a really important point that we need a privacy law because data deals are going to need some sort of supervision.
See, the data deal has happened precisely because there is no law. And assuming it takes another 18 months for the act to come into force, in 18 months, I don't know whether you can have 18 deals or 180 deals. People, are waiting for opportunity. And if you know that there is this kind of a law coming, there is always a tendency to go around the law much before the law becomes operative, unless they make the law retrospective, which is also another problem.
No, good Lord, no. We need at least a 2-year transition period. Don't make it retrospective.
That's all. You see, and you talked of good citizenship. Now tell me, any person who runs a factory as a good citizen should say, my factory should be properly done in accordance with the regulation that is already there on the statute book. If all that had been followed, why did the Bhopal tragedy occur? Why is that styrene, styrene gas in Visakhapatnam? Hey, look, it always is somebody's greed. Let us be honest about it. If you have greater concern for your neighbor, you will not throw your rubbish into his courtyard. Always so. The moment you do it, that shows that you are not a good citizen. And this is true. You handle it. I would attach as much importance to data leakage as the styrene gas or methane, whatever that methyl carbonate, some gas.
Methyl isocyanate.
I mean, it may not be in terms of physical death, but it's certainly erosion of all democratic values that we talk of. We show the constitution in the background with a flag. We should really follow the principles.
Rahul, the next question is directed to you from Abhishek Yadav about the Arogya Setu app. Are we ready for any technical glitches in this application, and who would be blamed if there are any glitches? Do the terms and conditions of the app specifically list this aspect out?
So, to answer from the technical side, yes, in terms of the app is quite rigorously tested, and we've got people from some of the top institutions of the country looking at it, as well as people from industry looking at the app. And so just in terms of preparedness, yes, there is a team that is constantly looking for these sorts of things. I think the Arogya Setu team declared already that the New York Times had reached out to them and said there is some sort of vulnerability. That vulnerability was fixed almost immediately. There was an ethical hacker who recently reached out and pointed out to some other vulnerabilities that was also responded to. There is, I think it is support.arogyasetu at nic.com or .org or .in or whatever, which is the email address for any bugs or any things that you have. And as with all technology development, it is impossible to have a perfect app. So if there are any bugs that people have identified, I think please do send it up. I can tell you that the team really looks at all of these in some detail, and if there's a vulnerability, fixes it, as you could see with that New York Times piece. And if not, responds saying, look, this is the clarification. Justice Sri Krishna, you will be happy to know that we've never had a sort of a data breach notification requirement until it was there in the PDP draft. And so the team used some of those provisions to actually think through what a sort of notification needed to be made once the New York Times spoke about the vulnerability, and followed a lot of those principles in terms of just to see, has anyone's data been leaked? If no one's data has been leaked, then what do we do? And then do we notify everyone? Will it cause a panic? I mean, you and I have had these discussions. How many people, if you notify too early, it'll cause a panic. If you don't notify at all, then security would be at breach. So all of those discussions actually happened. And that was so those were the two incidents that we spoke about, New York Times as well as that French hacker. And I believe that we responded in a manner which is the way in which first of all, I don't think any government app so far has responded in this manner. So I think that is certainly something which is commendable for the team. But there's no substitute for a law and for a regulator actually giving us guidance at times like this.
No, Rahul, I have one comment to make. Just like you are a legal ethical hacker who helps you in ensuring that there is no technological flaw with the app, there should also be encouragement given to legal hackers who will find out what is wrong with the legal position of that, and listen to them also.
Absolutely. No, absolutely. And look, I've been on a few webinars where these questions have been posed to me. And as you will note, the privacy policy has undergone 2 iterations. So there was one privacy policy, there's a second one. There's a third version of the privacy policy in terms of service that will come out soon, factoring in a lot of the comments that have come from people who have said, look, this is not clear, that is not clear. In addition, there are various other clarifications. When you write something, you don't fully understand all the implications. And I will tell you this, the community, and I keep telling you this, Shashi Krishna, it's around privacy that this whole tech policy community has been built. It is a vibrant, very active community that is not afraid to point out these things. And I've, personally, to the extent possible, I am very keen to tap into that community. And if there are any legal issues that we need to fix in the privacy policy, we fix it. And there will be a third version of the privacy policy that will come out now that you will see has fixed many of the concerns that people have raised, even in the last policy.
Good. Very good.
So Kunal has one question on the PDP bill itself, saying that had it been an ideal legislation, how would we address the fact that it sits with a set of blanket exemptions under Section 35 of the bill? And considering that these are broad and extensively subjective, how could this, really be actually sort of a safeguard?
I will leave that to Justice Sri Krishna. He has strong views on this, so I'm not going to say anything.
Look, I already said that if you don't have a legislation which can pass the triple test constitutional validity formulated in Kutaswamy judgment, then the law is unconstitutional, and passing a law like this, giving the executive the authority to give, a declaration. I think it is necessary in the interest of sovereignty of country to do it. What is sovereignty of country? How is it necessary? Or I think it is necessary. Now imagine a situation like this. I hereby think, or I'll say, whereas, let's use the language of the notification. Whereas it is considered necessary to protect the health of the public at large, or what is that, health and order, it is necessary to do it. Is it sufficient? That is the problem. You have to have a properly considered situation where you have the authority to curtail the fundamental right of the citizen, and that has to necessarily pass the triple test. Now, every time the triple test must be applied to any solution that you come across and say whether it is constitutional or not. Or else, as I have always said, and I continue to say it, we will be turned into 1984 Orwellian state.
Thank you, sir. I think we have really overshot our time, and I mean, you've been both very gracious with your time. So we'll bring the session to a close, though there are quite a few other questions as well. Let me just begin by thanking you both for this, I mean, really wonderful conversation. I mean, and the amount of thought that you both have put into this whole issue of privacy, especially in times like this, and how important that right is, and at the same time, how important technological innovation is, right, to addressing some of these concerns. I think, that this is really a very, very balanced and informative conversation on how we need to think going forward. I mean, and for all our audience here, let me also remind you that this is only the beginning, and we have a lot of exciting conversations lined up for the rest of this week. In fact, tomorrow you can catch Archana Sivasubramanian in conversation with Matthew Chako, Sahil Dio, Kriti Trehan, and Adya Mishra. And the conversation is on data and the legal profession, particularly important for law students who are looking to specialize in technology, law, and policy. To register, just check out our social media handles. Thank you all. And for any additional questions, do reach out to us at www.dakshafellowship.org or to 99400 This is our helpline number. We are in the middle of our second round of admissions to avail of the 100% tuition waivers that we are offering, and to pursue a policy track, a legal and policy track, which explores technology, law, and policy in depth and looks into some of these questions. Do consider the Daksha Fellowship as a potential opportunity. Thank you again, Justice Sri Krishna and Rahul, for this really enlightening conversation.